So, hello, Linda, aka Emma Stevens, and thank you so much for joining me on the show today. I'm really looking forward to exploring your book, A Fire is Coming, and learning all about your experiences. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Well, sure. And thank you, Casey, for having me on. I really appreciate it. Yes, my name is Linda Campbell Pevac, and I have used a pseudonym to write my books of Emma Stevens. And I've written The Gathering Place was my first book, an adoptee story. And the second book that just came out is A Fire is Coming.
There is so much to highlight about this memoir today that feels so prevalent right now. The amount of emails and contacts that I've had from people asking about abusive therapists and cult survivors that leave high demand, controlling, exploitative environments and then try to find the right support and fall into a professional's care to then continue being exploited is quite wild to me. It's not really something I ever thought would happen in that space. And I don't know if it's naivety or if it's kind of my own education journey, but your memoir really brought to light all of the issues that so many people have explained to me. Have you had that sort of feedback from people that have read your book?
I've had a lot of people connect with me saying they knew something was wrong, but after they read my book, they could see that definitely the red flags were there. And that was my intent, not only to heal for myself, but to be sort of a cautionary tale to other people to make sure that you can research and interview your therapist before you employ them, and they do work for you. It's not
It's
the other way around.
That's so true. That's so true. And it's interesting for me to hear your voice on the other side because I listened to your audiobook, which I now realize was actually narrated by you yourself. And I think that always adds a little special touch to people that narrate their own memoirs. So a little bit of information for the listeners there. It is also available on audiobook. So just before we get into how you came to meet your therapist, would you be able to give the listeners a little bit of an introduction to you and your early life?
Absolutely, because I think it is a very important part for me to mention that I'm an adopted person that was relinquished at birth and then adopted as a baby into an adoptive family. And that carries with it a whole lot of grief and trauma that a lot of people don't understand happens with adopted people, because we know it about puppies and kittens that we don't send them out into the world to a new family until, what is it, 6 to 12 weeks, something like that. But yet with a human being, we think that they can be severed from their mother right there at birth, and that the adoptee is just going to be okay because we're blank slates and we don't know what's going on. But science has proven that is not the case. So I truly believe that I had that in my psyche, and all that trauma was held in my body. Then I went to an adoptive family that hadn't done their interior work as people. And so then they have two babies come into the home and they expect us to be exactly who they tell us we should be. And so later I talk about how I've been a cult hopper because I was conditioned to be adaptable, to be a people pleaser, and to be a perfectionist to try to outrun any kind of criticism or punishment. And so that's what I grew up and was conditioned with throughout my childhood. And then when I get out into the world, well, it's no big surprise that I find people that imitate the exact situation that I had in my childhood.
You explore so much in A Fire is Coming about attachment theory and developmental phases of of newborns, infants, children, adolescents, which is not something that I've really looked into too much in terms of a child that's put up for, or a baby that's put up for adoption. So there's, I imagine, a lot more of that explored in your first book.
Yes, I believe the first one is what I needed to tell myself and everyone else how my whole life has been colored by adoption. And I'll be an adopted person until I no longer walk this earth. I don't know how to be anything else, you know. But it does explain a lot of the things of each developmental stage of how I would make choices. And it was all influenced by me being an adopted person.
Were you able to find any type of positive framework for a person that is relinquished at birth to be in a type of environment that would help them to feel supported and loved and cared for? Or is that something that you think is missing from that area altogether?
Oh, no. And I can only speak to my own situation. Um, my childhood home happened to be where the lack of attachment and just the nurturing and the emotional deprivation was huge in my household. Now, that is my situation, but there are other adoptees that have had loving homes and it's been a great situation, but yet there's still that caution that adoptive parents need to realize there is that trauma and grief when the baby is born and severed from their mother. And so the idea is to start therapy and understanding and research and education early and not wait until little Johnny is 12 and going to school and starting to smoke cigarettes or whatever, acting out, and think, oh, I wonder if adoption has anything to do with it or not. Just they should be able to know that at the get-go, be trauma informed that they're going to have, even if it's unconscious, they're going to have some kind of reaction to the fact that they were severed from their biology.
When your book begins, and we are in the first few pages of A Fire is Coming, you are already embroiled in a relationship that has its difficulties, and that's the moment we start the book. So your earlier years, they kind of feed in and out of the book throughout the various chapters, which I thought was a really nice touch. And I imagine maybe it was a decision because you had the first book, or maybe you have to really weigh up what you're going to include when you write a memoir because there's so much to pack in. But I wondered if you could just talk the listeners through what this relationship was like, how you met each other, and how it played a role in how you began meeting with this therapist.
Sure. I was newly married, and I think my husband and I had only been married maybe a year, and we were renting a house in Laguna Beach, California. And so the fire that I mentioned at the beginning of the book was an actual real fire, and we really did have to escape from it. And then that was my idea of how, when I meet this psychologist, not only am I trying to escape a real fire, but then there's also more fire that's symbolic to go throughout the book. But my psychologist was my next door neighbor. I met her on my driveway at our mailboxes one afternoon. And from the get-go, now that I'm looking back, you know, we always have that hindsight. I see that the indoctrination started right then. And we had a conversation. She gave me her business card. And I had said that I was looking for a therapist because I was already having marital difficulties. We were having infertility troubles. And I said, I don't know if it has anything to do with anything, but I have this adoption angst that I would like to explore and maybe try to heal from. And so from that point forward, the next week I found myself in her office, and it was kind of a slow, insidious methodology, how she indoctrinated me and fostered a dependency on her after she knew my Achilles heel, which is that I never had a loving mother.
The uncomfortable feeling of your interactions with the psychologist start early on when there's an almost small confrontation of you just taking the bins out or something and seeing your neighbor and being like, oh hey, I was thinking about speaking to somebody, not necessarily you. Can you recommend someone? And straight away, there's this kind of feeling that you were, or it's suggested by the psychologist that you approached her looking for her to be your therapist when that's not actually how you positioned it. And it's almost like you don't have a choice. She's like, okay, I'll see you tomorrow. You can come and talk with me. And it's straight away, it's kind of just like, I think if my neighbor was a psychologist, they're so friendly and they're so nice that if they said, right, you just come round tomorrow and we're going to get this sorted, I would feel like rude if I said no. But it's again, it's ignoring or not recognizing red flags until it's kind of two steps too far. So after you met your psychologist and you have this first session, are there any specific things that you remember speaking about or how you felt sitting down to speak with her?
I think it's important to mention the power differential of when someone holds a credential and charges $300 an hour, and you have no experience, that I had no experience about what therapeutic boundaries look like or what therapy even was. I just was very naive and going in to thinking that, just like you said, I felt so lucky. This person wants to help me. She seems nice. She's my next door neighbor. And I have a person's name on a card. So for me, I see how I framed it of like I had just struck gold, but yet I think she had the plan all along to kind of lure me in and start to groom me. And in the book, I really try to take it slow through the process, because I think a lot of people think it can't happen to them. And, you know, oh, I would never fall for that line, or I wouldn't find myself in that situation. And so for the book, I really wanted to take it slow, each step of how she just disconnected my intuition one little bit at a time. And for her, for me specifically, it was one hug at a time. She
Yes.
started hugging me very early on. And in my book, I talk about the hormone oxytocin. And that's something an adoptee doesn't get to experience, because when you sever the mom and the baby, that hormone doesn't get transmitted and that bonding process doesn't occur. So that's why an adoptee starts to form and shape differently, because they're already thinking, what's happening? What's going on? Trauma is in their body already. So she kind of knew instinctively how to lure me in by lots of hugs, lots of touching, lots of, I'm here for you, and I'm going to be the mother you've never had.
The way that you were able to shape the funneling of your interactions and your involvement with this person is so expert. It really does kind of go through every single step. And by the end of it, it's such a massive crescendo that you could kind of see all the pieces coming together, but it's still quite shocking when you end up in the position that you finally are existing in. It's kind of like reading a psychological thriller. And if I hadn't done so many of these interviews, I would, maybe part of me would be questioning whether or not this was, is this fiction? Or did this really happen? So I just want to kind of put that out there for the listeners, that it does kind of have that feel to it as well, for anybody that's looking for something a little bit different in the best way possible as well, I must say. So in this first meeting with your or with the psychologist, you weren't sure how much you were going to share or what things you wanted to bring up, but it's this idea of opening up and holding nothing back comes into play almost immediately.
Yes, in fact, it was almost a berating of me, saying that I was doing therapy wrong, because she said, you have to tear these walls down. You must trust me. And, that just makes me think of the bite model of Stephen Hassan, but, of how the control started immediately. And she said, if you can't be vulnerable, which is true for therapy, you have to be vulnerable. And that's what makes this so insidious, because if you want therapy to work, you have to trust that person, let them in, and know that they're going to be working with your psyche. So I do slowly get chipped away with my resolve to not be vulnerable. I become vulnerable. And that's when I really lost all agency over my life. And I just really didn't know what I was doing, what I was feeling. It was breaking apart my marriage. She told me I should leave my husband. And she even had us do couples therapy together, only to tell me later that after I've seen the two of you together, I'm convinced that he is no good for you, and that she would personally be so much better for me than my husband.
Sprinkled in with all of the really wild and irrational things that the psychologist would go on to say in later sessions and interactions were always kind of nuggets of truth or nuggets of things that sounded rational and feasible. And and that almost feels as well like one of the main tactics, along with the kind of like slow touching your hand on your shoulder, giving you a hug. It feels as though that plays a big role in the way that the psychologist was able to get to gaslight you, for one thing, and to second guess whether you and your critical thinking voice that was always there were in the wrong, and not her. And it makes me think about whether or not psychologists are using the in some cases, of course, not all cases, are using the training that they are given to explicitly use that to exploit vulnerable individuals by knowing how to use language and how to approach people. Would you say that, I know that you've explored so much of this in your book, but would you say that this is something that was happening in your situation?
Yes, I would say absolutely. It's like she knew how to use, I call it the punishment reward system, grooming and love bombing. And once she knew that she had me in the palm of her hand, then the punishment started. If she felt me pulling away from her, then she would tell me, you're either bipolar or have borderline personality disorder. And she was diagnosing me, and that really scared me, because at that point I truly believed her. But I see now she used that as a tactic to get me to behave so she could better control me and better be able to tell me what my next step was going to be. Because by then, I had lost all agency over my marriage, my job, anything about my life. She had cut me off from friends, really going to my workplace, because that interfered with what she wanted me to be doing. I'm really surprised I didn't lose my job. I did later, but not right then.
When you initially meet the psychologist and you sit down to have your first conversation with her or session, she is in a relationship with somebody else, then they're living together at this point.
Yes, they owned the house together that was right beside the rental that my husband and I lived in. So they were very much, I mean, for all purpose, they were married. And that's one of the red flags. If your therapist talks a lot about their own life and what their innermost feelings are about their mate, that's probably not something they should be sharing with a client. But she started doing that fairly early, especially when she started saying that my husband wasn't right for me. That's when she introduced, I know this because my mate's not right for me either, and I will probably be asking her to move. So looking back now, I see how each little step was she had in place. It was a whole agenda.
And also in the early interactions, there were instances of the psychologist sharing private information about previous clients that she'd sat down with as well, which was another massive red flag in your mind at the time it was happening as well.
Yeah, she started crossing all kinds of boundaries, of talking about other clients, of allowing me to be in the room with her when she had a client on the phone doing a session. That's in no way an ethical, it's just gross negligence. But she also started inviting me over to her home next door, and then she'd invite my husband and I both over. So the boundary crossing was just crazy. But the thing that an unethical exploitative therapist will do is make you think that it's all your fault. If you ever tell anyone, it's gonna, I'm gonna let them know it's your fault and you made this all happen. And it's just their way to try to step aside the boundary crossing and blame the client.
There's a ramping up of sessions quite early on. And you explained that you're not in a financial situation to be able to see your psychologist as regularly as she says you need to see her. And she also mentions that without her help, your marriage is going to continue to decline and you're never going to resolve the issues that you have from childhood. Do you recall how many sessions before things drastically changed? Do you remember how many sessions you were seeing her for a week?
I know it started off as once a week, then she convinced me to go twice a week. Then it was, she wanted me to come 3 times, and she had said, I'm not going to make you pay for all of this. So it became sort of a, I don't know, in her mind, it was probably a barter system of just an opportunity to get closer to me. And like I said, after we'd have a session, then I'd be invited over to her home later that same day. So I wasn't actually paying for all the sessions, but I did pay for quite a bit. And that's also a boundary crossing to make a client feel guilty for therapy, unpaid therapy. It was just another hook into my psyche to think that I owed her my life, and made me think that she was the only one that could ever help me in any way, shape, or form. And then it was, divorce your husband because he is no good for you, and I am your only salvation. She was like my guru.
Communications, even though she lives next door, increase as well in terms of text messages and phone calls. And in the book, there's this really great explanation of how you become in this. I mean, I know it's called A Fire Is Coming, and there's lots of talk about smoke and stuff, but you're almost entering a fog where you are struggling to have conversations with your husband or be present at work, and your phone would start ringing. What effect did this have on your marriage before your husband moved out?
Well, it was just slow chipping away of any relationship at all. I mean, it got to be where, even though my husband and I worked together at the same agency, um, I just wasn't speaking to him anymore. And he would ask me, what's going on? I know there's something going on between you and the psychologist. And that by that time, the psychologist had built him to be the enemy. And my husband was rather narcissistic. There was a lot of that component. So I was very confused of who was the good guy, who was the bad guy, and what am I in this whole thing? And I just felt like everyone else was moving me around like a pawn. So it really does work its way up into a crescendo where she calls me at work one day and says, I've done what I knew you could not do. I've moved all your things into my home next door, and you're going to be my mate now.
How did you react to that?
I was horrified. I put my head on my desk and just cried because, one, I didn't know how to help myself. It wasn't like I had agency to say, what are you talking about? That's crazy. That's not going to happen. I'm going to go over there and get all my stuff and move it right back. No, I was in the frame of mind where I just felt I've never felt that way in my life, of being like, I really should have had some serious help and intervention. And I end up willingly going to her house and living there for the next 2 months.
Your relationship of somebody going to see their therapist changes drastically at that point. And I wondered if you could just talk the listeners through all of those really convoluted puzzle pieces as well that just come together to enforce this ceiling system that this woman has created.
By the time I got into her home, and I did see for a fact that she had all my stuff in her home. And at that point, my brain is struggling with, what will my husband think about this? And what am I doing? But at the same time, I'm here, and she's just pushing all the buttons, and then starts to tell me, and I consider this part of the punishment reward system. because she lures me in with all this love bombing and I'm going to be the mother you never had. I was like a child, really. And she started saying, oh, and by the way, I don't want you to go to work today. I would like you to pick up the cleaning and, take care of the dogs and have dinner on the table. And so this started slowly increasing. That didn't all happen in one day. It was a slow progression of where it dawned on me exactly how she saw my role to be in this whole thing. And I tell in the book how my husband at the time was feeding me with information about cult-like behaviors of what a sociopath will do and what they'll tell you to do. And he would say, does this seem or feel anything like that? And I had, just little kernels would seep into my clarity and think, oh my gosh, it does sound a little like that. And so it started to shake me up enough. And I think I was pulling away from her enough where she started to get totally unhinged. Her erratic behavior became violent and emotionally dysregulated. And it got to be physical, of slamming me against walls and that kind of thing. And it was enough for me to finally have the mist clear enough, at least for that moment, to think, I need to run for my life right now. And so while she was at work, I did do that and got away from her. But just like we know in psychology, just because you leave a setting, it doesn't mean you're healed. So I took all of that with me, and I was almost in more psychic pain afterward than when I was living with her, because of all the reasons of why she had captured me. Just all those little emotional hooks she just had throughout my body. And I carried those with me, even though I did escape her home. So that took many years, really, to resolve all that. And, who knows, maybe I'm going to be resolving that for the rest of my life.
I mentioned before about parts of the book feeling almost like psychological thrillers. That moment where you go to the house to take your stuff out was so stressful. How do you progress through this next step? Have you moved back in with your husband? Do you continue to have interactions with this woman?
And that was so difficult. I don't know that I can even give a short answer to that, because it wasn't linear. It wasn't that this day I left her and then my life continued. It was so painfully slow. And I would say suicidal ideation was very much present with me, because I found myself out of the panic situation, but yet then I had to face everything that had happened. And I did end up going back to my husband. But that was really hard, because I knew it wasn't the ideal situation either. All I knew is it was a way out. And he was feeding me information that was helping me understand how people like this can try to cloud your vision and your heart and your emotions. And I still think it was the right move for me to make, because shortly after that, between my husband and another counselor, and an attorney, I started to realize I had a true obligation to go to the Board of Ethics and turn her in and make a complaint. But I can't tell you how loud the voice was in my head of her saying, if you ever tell anyone, I'm just going to say it was all your fault. And don't you realize how special our relationship was? And I know you'll never do something like that. And a part that I did leave out is that throughout therapy, she did tell me all the other people she had done this to. But I was the most special because the others were, crazy, but I was her special one. But there was evidence that she used her client pool to use for her house repairs. Her former mate was also her former client. It just goes on. She was a repeat offender, let's just put it that way. So it was when I took a turn to getting well is when I decided to get a master's in psychology, because I started learning about personality disorders and tried to learn about what she said she had diagnosed me with, of bipolar or borderline personality. And, I really considered that. And I was thinking that just doesn't line up. And I realized she was just throwing that at me to try to trip me up and to keep me right where she wanted me. But learning about psychology really helped so much. And then having my own children, that really kind of set me on a path of trying to get well so I could be a good mother for my children. But I tell you, it still didn't, I didn't do all of it. This happened 29 years ago. In fact, this October, it'll be 30 years. When I started getting real, true, proper, healthy therapy 6 years ago is when I really started connecting all the dots and had, really faced all the residual trauma that I hadn't faced before. All the things I went to her for in the first place, I started resolving 6 years ago.
And I think that's a really important thing to highlight with anybody listening who may be on their own journey of deconstruction and recovery, is that this is also not linear. It's not something that can happen overnight or over a week. A lot of people that have come on the show have talked about how decades after an experience, they still have moments where they'll hear a song or they'll see a clip from a movie or somebody will say a certain phrase, and all of a sudden they can be thrown back into this experience in this environment that's extremely triggering and upsetting, how they are still unpacking certain things and understanding their own triggers. And it's not something that can, it's not a like a race that can be sprinted. It's more like a marathon that you have to tackle over time and takes continuous work, which sounds exhausting, and I imagine that it absolutely must be, but also necessary in order to understand experiences and arm yourself against any potential future exploitation that you might be faced with.
No, I totally agree. And that's where I would say that now that I know my patterns and who I was in my before 6 years ago, I was a cold hopper. I went from the indoctrination of my adoptive parents, and then I went to several other relationships that were people trying to tell me who I was. And then I married a person that was on the spectrum of being a narcissist. And then I give my life to a psychologist who basically just almost burned me alive. So there were other things that even happened after that. I didn't stop my patterns until 6 years ago. And only then can I say, have I found peace and I found a way to be comfortable in my own skin and to see how everything was all connected. There were no tangents in my life of, oh, then I ran off and did this, or, and then I did that crazy thing. It was all connected. So much clarity has happened. And when you get to that point of your transformation, I think it gets exciting because you do have so much more clarity, and then you become thirsty for more clarity. And so you research more and you become more dedicated and you practice who you want to become. And I think that's the great part of where I am now, is that I did have that trauma, and I know it's still with me, and it's always going to be with me, but I've learned how to manage it. And I've learned the signs of when I am in a complex PTSD moment. I know how to talk myself out of it, give myself grace, and I just am able to diffuse it a lot faster than I didn't even know what was happening before, but now I do.
These moments in your writing when your husband at the time is bringing you information on cults and coercive control, and parts of it are ringing so true with you, it almost causes an extra panic on top of what you're already experiencing, because it puts your cognitive dissonance into overdrive. You have this psychologist that is telling you one thing, and using all types of abuses to confirm in your mind the things that she is saying, but you also have your husband giving you this information that is very true, very rational, really speaks to your critical thinking and the the thoughts that you're having in your own mind that you don't share with your psychologist. And it's almost like a fever pitch at one point. And it's a really tricky spot, because to understand the tactics and methods that are being used to exploit you, you have to go through that process. So I wondered if you could just talk the listeners through what that was like and how others might be able to manage that.
Yeah. Uh-huh. I was just feeling every word you were just saying, because at that time, the cognitive dissonance was like my brain and my whole body, mind and body, spirit was on fire. And it was that struggle of, knowing a little bit about the clarity, but yet to give that up of who I had built her up to be, my guru, the answer to my everything, my survival, really. It just meant I would have to completely unravel. And I think that part scared me more than listen to the red flags. So as that progresses, it's like the balance shifts of where the red flags get so heavy. And the analogy that a lot of people use is that the shelf finally broke. There was no ability or possibility of ignoring it anymore. I have an ability, I'm pretty tenacious. And so I think in that moment that you talked about, that's so exciting in the book where I escape, is that part of me was ruling the day. It was the F you, I'm getting out of here. And my anger just powered me through that whole thing. But I would also admit that it only lasted as long as I got to my former husband's house, where I was going to live for the next 12 years. And I was crushed and started almost immediately missing her. And I think that speaks to the psychological damage that a therapist, counselor, doctor can do, even any power differential can do to someone if they've reduced you to this childlike state. And so that's what I had to fight for many years after that, is an ebb and flow of wanting her, but saying, no, she's evil. And it would just be this back and forth and back and forth. And when I even took her, I filed a civil lawsuit. And that was really traumatic too, because I got re-traumatized hearing the testimony, had to see her in court. And then the mediator was very uneducated about what psychological damage can be done. And I think that speaks to a society. We need to get the court system and the judicial system to understand what it means to lose agency over your life. And that's what Janja Lalich, the cult expert, says, is that bounded choice is not a real choice. You're not coming from a place of being fully your free will of making any kind of choice at all.
The decision to take this woman to court is another very difficult moment in the book that almost feels like it's not entirely a decision that you make independently. A lot of it is encouraged by your husband at the time. Some of the things that happened to you in those rooms made me just feel so uncomfortable. There's a moment where your diaries are read, your private diaries are used by her as ammunition against you. Could you just talk the listeners through what your process was like of trying to take legal action against somebody, and any recommendations you would have for people who are also thinking about maybe doing the same thing?
Yeah, I hate to paint a dim story of more trauma, because I do want people to come forth. And in fact, if anyone prior to me that the psychologist had exploited had come forth, then it may not have happened to me. And when I heard things like that, it was a collective decision between myself, my husband, and the attorney and the new counselor. If it were only my decision, I don't know what I would have come up with. I don't think I was able to think my way out of a paper bag, to tell you the truth. But the more sense it made to me, and it wasn't anyone saying you must do this. I feel like it was, we all decided that with the facts that we knew, and now that we had all the information and could look back at what happened, there was no other choice for me other than to report her. Not to say it was easy, because it wasn't even easy with the Board of Ethics, because the burden of proof was still on me. I had to substantiate what happened, and they wanted to defend their own. So it ended up that the Board of Psychology revoked her license, but the Board of Social Workers gave her a slap on the wrist and had minimal supervision, where she had to be supervised while she was counseling, and fully reinstated in a short amount of time. She's still practicing today at $400 an hour.
That's absolutely shocking. Do you use her real name in the book?
I do not.
Oh gosh, it would just be so good to be able to do a little Google search of my potential therapist and find out all of this. With freedom of information, if you were to do a search, there would be court records of
Yes,
your potential therapist if they had been involved in something like that, which is always something I recommend people doing. I mean,
absolutely.
just a simple Google search, you never know what's going to come up, even if it's like some yoga group that you're thinking of joining or some
Yes.
holiday retreat you're thinking of going on. A good Google can kind of swerve you in the direction of that place or the opposite direction. But when you talk about your transformation, there's a few moments throughout this legal process where you get some of your fire back for yourself, and you get some of the power back for yourself.
Yes, there were both. I mean, there's one where I say where it was so difficult to see her, hear her voice. And something I've left out is all the methods she would use of, I think therapists study this, or at least the ones that want to use it as a method to lure people into mind reform. The way she dressed, the way she talked, the way she hesitated a little too long, the penetrating stare, the look over her glasses. There were a lot of things that were techniques used, and she was doing all of that again in the courtroom, and I was right in front of her. So that was so difficult to be in. I could feel her energy. But at the same time, I was carrying a secret literally within me that I found out I was pregnant with my second child. And I had found out that very morning that I was on the stand. And it really, once I was getting pounded by the defense attorney, actually, let's call it malpractice attorney, because he was protecting the money that they were going to have to give. I was feeling all of his harshness and all of his criticism, but at the same time, I did get in touch with, I'm pregnant and I love my little girl that I've already had, and I'm having another baby. And it really helped fuel me to make through that very difficult situation.
When you become attached to the hero of the story, these small wins have a much bigger impact than they would have in other types of writing, I think. And that's what's really powerful about the art of memoir writing. And this was a really special one, as I said, for the reasons at the start. So many people have reached out to talk about exploitative therapists and counselors. After the resolution of the legal proceedings, where do you go from there as an individual?
We had moved away from Laguna Beach by that time. And in fact, she left her home and went to another area. So there was no relationship left at that point at all, which was a good thing. And then my whole life shifted towards finishing my master's and also raising my two little babies. But yet really what I did is compartmentalized everything that happened. The going to psychology courses really helped me, but in a large part, I did compartmentalize and didn't really bring that box back open until my children were grown, because then I had the time to really deal with it and think about it. Because I think I carried that shame all along, thinking I must have done it. I must have been the person that she says I am. So I wasn't willing, or my psyche wasn't ready yet to open that box until there was sort of a catalyst where I opened a lot of boxes in my life. And that was just one of them.
How did you decide to sit down and write this book? Was this a continuation of your kind of, you feel like a calling to perhaps highlight the exploitative nature of therapists and counselors, how you felt when you decided to go ahead with these legal proceedings? Or is it something you've always done? Or did you just fall into it? I'm always really interested in how people manage to sit down and write not one, but two full manuscripts.
Well, there is a little background in my life of writing. When I was in my childhood home, my parents there wasn't really any talking with my parents. They would just be authoritarian and tell us what to think. So I would go to my room and get a piece of paper and a pen and try to express myself with words, trying to think about what I was feeling. And usually they turned out to be apology letters to them because I was a people pleaser and I wanted everything to be okay. But at the same time, I was learning a skill of how to write. And then fast forward to, I got an undergrad in journalism. So I was writing a lot and had always been told that, hey, you're a pretty good writer. So it wasn't really a big stretch to think that I might sit down and actually write a book, but it wasn't. I'd written a lot of things that just sounded like a diary, like all those journals that I had written. But then something happened in the pandemic and I started doing EMDR. That's really what started the whole thing, because I was asked by my certified counselor of EMDR to imagine a safe place. And so I had this visual of a tree and grassy mountains and wildflowers. That's the cover of my first book, The Gathering Place. In fact, that was my special place, the gathering place. And throughout that book, I talk about how I, weave my inner parts or my younger selves, and I have conversations with them. And it was all because of EMDR that I was able to think of that concept. And then I thought, I have all my facts of my life that read like a diary, but what if I weave them around an EMDR type situation? And I think it really worked. People have said that it really was able to, they see their own lives throughout what I'm saying my story is. And so then I do include a little bit of the or what happened to me with a psychologist in the first book. So about 8 months after I wrote the first book, I thought, you know what, I'm not done. I have more to say about that specific experience. And then again, I was just possessed where I could not type fast enough to get it out of me. And then I thought about the fire being just like EMDR was the way I weaved my story. The fire was how I weaved this story.
But I mean, if people want all of the details, the best thing to do is go and pick up the book, which I highly recommend listeners go and do. There's a moment where the fire has almost damaged everything apart from where you're living. There's just so many moments in the book that kind of have this strange symbolic nature almost. So I see exactly why you used that as a theme to stitch everything together. And it's just such an educational and wonderfully written book. And I really hope that other people will consider grabbing a copy. It's a conversation in the anti-cult space that I think there needs to be more about, more awareness of, more studies done. Do you use your masters in a professional capacity as well as with your writing?
Well, I do use the tools that I learned. And I was a physical trainer, a personal trainer for about 18 years and a group exercise. And so I found that I could use my psychology with my clients because often they'd come in and they'd say, I just don't feel like working out today. And so I realized I had to get through that angst, whatever they were. So I'd talk with them and I had good interpersonal relationships with them. And then I could say, okay, now we're going to do some squats. Now we're going to do some push-ups. So I was
Yeah.
able to use all of that. And now I look back and see that I was in advertising before that, and I used psychology. And then it was a personal trainer, used psychology there. Then having children, you use psychology, right? And then I get to use it with writing my books. And so I think it's just a part of me, but no, I don't have a certificate. I didn't do the hours, and I'm not a professional counselor in any shape or form.
Professional writer, to say the least, is definitely something that's up there. And it's really fascinating that you talk about using psychology in so many different capacities, but never in a way that is used to exploit or harm others. And I think that that's the key thing to explore in this last part of our talk. How can a person find a safe therapist, a safe counselor? How can people arm themselves, protect themselves when it's likely that they are already in a heightened state of vulnerability and really need some support and some help?
Yes, that's a very good question. And to answer that, if even if I had Googled, well, I don't know that Google was even available, but even if I had researched the court records about my psychologist, nothing would have shown up because no one had come forth. They were all too psychologically damaged to even write out their testimony. And we even tried to get them part of our court proceeding, but they were not willing. And I understand completely because it was really difficult. But nowadays that we have all the technology that we have, you can do health grade and you can check and see if there have been any complaints or what they say about your doctor. And also know that you can say, I'm considering hiring you. Could I have a 15-minute consultation? And you can see and ask them pointed questions. And if you get a sense that they're defensive, or that, there's just some kind of red flag in your system that they're not being authentic or transparent, then I'd say keep going and find someone else. If you feel like that they're talking too much about themselves, that's a red flag. If they keep you over your allotted time, and they say, oh, my other client canceled, you can stay for another hour, that's a red flag. If they invite you off campus out of the therapy session to go to their home, a movie, dinner, a walk, whatever, that's a red flag. That's blurring the boundaries. And so I think that's part of why I'm an advocate, is to let people know that if awareness is key on every issue, the more we know about this, the more we can steer clear, because these type sociopathic people are in every profession. They're in our schools, there are policemen, anyone can be of that nature. So we have to be careful and do our homework as an individual to make sure we're staying safe.
Tricky to consider abusive therapists because they are specifically trained and certified in being ethical and not abusing their power, their knowledge, their status, their position. So when this happens, it's almost like it's almost like a double whammy. It's almost worse that it's happening in these environments, because this is exactly where it should never happen. And it's a tricky thing to try and unpick.
I agree, because you already buy off on the fact that they have a credential, they're a doctor, they've been to school for 8 years, whatever. You automatically give them that respect and honor that they know what they're doing. So that's, I think, why it makes it so insidious, and you don't question because they have those credentials and there's that power differential. So we have to realize that we have rights. We have consumer rights to find out where we're going to be safe. And just because someone has a lot of certifications on the wall does not mean that they're qualified.
People talk about HIPAA violations a lot. And so HIPAA is an acronym for the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996. And I think that what's important about that particular acronym is that you can go and research exactly what it means, and when there's been a HIPAA violation or breach, and maybe that's one step towards understanding your rights as a client by reading up what is expected of a therapist, a counselor, and a doctor, and what a client can expect in those environments. So maybe I'll pop a link to that website in the episode description for anybody that's wondering, well, what are the boundaries? What are the legal boundaries? What are the ethical boundaries? And place some resources in there for anybody who might be wondering themselves what those things are exactly. But it's difficult because the nuanced approaches that are used by individuals that know how to coercively control an individual will probably also be aware in how to carefully skirt around certain things. And that's one of the really difficult things to navigate in these types of environments. So just before we finish up today, I wondered if you could tell the listeners who are maybe thinking about writing their own memoir, if you have any advice or little bits of wisdom that you can offer, and also where everybody can find a copy of either one of your books, but specifically A Fire is Coming for the purpose of today's conversation.
Sure, I would love to do that. And they both books are on Audible, which I really enjoyed reading and narrating both of those. The Gathering Place, an adoptee story, and the second one is A Fire is Coming. You can find those both on Amazon, and you can also, like I said, they're both on Audible. And I think even to back it up, before you even think about writing a book, is the idea of writing to heal. And that takes me back to the first part of my story when I said that I was a little girl in my room trying to, take those pre-verbal emotions and put them into language. And that just built upon itself where I didn't even know that I was doing somatic healing by journaling, just writing anything pen to paper. And that just progressed as I got older, being more and more of a skill. And writing to heal is a very real thing. Whether you get published, whether you write a book or not, but just writing down your thoughts, your emotions, or let's say you've just had a terrible argument with your boss and just trying to find out, why am I so angry with them? When you write your feelings down, it may be on page 6. You may have to go through a lot of garbage to get to the kernel of what, oh yeah, there's the essence of what I'm trying to say. But that's what writing's all about, is that it doesn't come out maybe in your first word. It might be on page 6, but it's still, all of that writing was important to get to page 6. And for writing, anyone, telling your story is so important. I hear a lot of people say, but it's been told before. My story doesn't have any fantastical things like maybe what I had, but no one can tell your story the way you can tell your story. And whether you publish or put it in a drawer or you make it for a legacy for your children or your family, it's just so important for you to give yourself that honor and that respect and self-worth that you matter, regardless of what happened to you, because we all have trauma. But just something about writing it out on paper makes it real. And I think we owe it to ourselves to do that.
Big thing I often have conversations with people about as well, through emails and communications, when people get in touch to express their interest in sharing their stories. And sometimes people will say, but I'm worried that my story is not interesting enough, or I'm worried that my story isn't severe enough. And the big emphasis is always on every single person's story is important. Everybody should be able to share in whatever capacity they feel comfortable with their experiences and their knowledge and their story. And there will always be something in everybody's world that can help to inform and educate another person, no matter anybody's personal reservations. And I would always encourage people to do that if it's something they feel they want to do but they're being held back. But the one thing I really wanted to end on, and to ask your insight into, and I suppose it might be one of the most important things we talk about, is if there are exploitative and abusive therapists, counselors, doctors, and professionals, but therapy can really positively change a person's life and save people's lives, there's a really difficult thing to balance there. And you've mentioned yourself that you 6 years ago entered into a type of therapy that's really helped you change your perspective and change your life. So we don't want to deter people from getting the support they need, but we want to make sure that we're not turning people away from the potential of accessing therapy and counselors. What do we look for on the flip side? And where can we go to find the right type of support? Specifically, like cult informed, trauma informed for listeners of this podcast, because again, that seems to be something that's lacking in the general public.
Well, it was very hard for me when I went to that first counselor after the exploitation, because so few counselors, therapists do know how to deprogram someone that's been in a coercive control situation like that. And like I said, it took me, I am sure she did somewhat help me, but it took me many years after that really to resolve it. But I am a huge proponent to go to counseling. I have two right now, and I'm ecstatic to tell anyone that wants to hear, because one, I go for cognitive therapy, and the other one is still my EMDR therapist, and we also do cognitive. But the perfect balance that we have is just instrumental and really has helped me so much. And the way you know that they're really good is they never tell you what to think. They never steal your epiphanies away from you by telling you what your epiphany is. They just allow you to, they're just really there as a guide, and not to be put on a pedestal of they're a guru or they know everything. Sometimes their lives are just as messed up as other people, but they are able to separate and see your situation. And yes, you do need to be vulnerable, because that's the only way that you're going to have breakthroughs. That's true. But just make sure you're doing a breakthrough with the right person. I think nowadays it's a lot easier to make sure you're in the safe place, because we have adoptee competent therapists that are adoptees themselves that are now becoming therapists. So, but even with that, you have to be careful. You have to make sure that what you think is competent is what they think is competent. And so I think just in any situation in our lives, we need to make sure that the communication is there. And my definition is what your definition is, and don't do any assuming of, well, they have that credential, so I'm sure they know how to do this, and I'm in a safe place. Just do your homework.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Linda. I truly appreciate it. And what an excellent memoir you've written that really encapsulates the tricky, nuanced difficulties in unweaving what is true to yourself and what is being taught to you by somebody that knows how to teach you those things and make you believe that you are responsible for those teachings and that they are your beliefs, and that these are the things that you deserve, or these are the things you've brought onto yourself, all for that person's own agenda. It's an excellent book, and I haven't read anything else that really highlights understanding how therapists and counselors can be using their positions of power and their knowledge to really traumatize or re-traumatize people for their own personal benefit and gain. It's such an important piece. It's extremely timely and prevalent right now because of this online space that we're being thrust into, with all of these individuals that say that they are professionals of Reiki, and there's somebody in my local village was telling me she was a licensed Reiki, like a licensed Reiki trainer, and she had credentials for it. But then when I looked it up, there isn't like a board of people that acknowledge when an individual can be a professional Reiki instructor, as far as I could find. So it's an incredible piece that is so important. There are a lot of online figures right now who are calling themselves gurus, who are calling themselves enlightened beings, who are really speaking to a demographic of vulnerable individuals that are most likely isolated and struggling with a lot of the same things that individuals that access therapy would be struggling with. So I truly appreciate your writing and your work. I don't know if you're planning on writing another book, but I would love to read it if you do.
Well, there's got to be a trilogy. There has to be a third one to, fill it out. So I haven't written it yet, but because I'm still living it right now, but I think there will be a third.
Excellent. That's fantastic news. And I'll put all the links in the episode description for listeners to find their own copy of A Fire is Coming by Linda Pevac, also known as Emma Stevens, the pseudonym, the author of A Fire is Coming. So thank you so much for your time today. I truly, truly appreciate it.
Thank you, Casey. I really appreciate you.
Take care and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, bye, bye.